The machine gun is one of the most potent and lethal weapons systems. As a killing system, it is both efficient and deadly, providing substantial firepower at the flick of a switch or trigger. It is a force multiplier of the ultimate kind that can be easily deployed by man or machine. The introduction of the machine gun has given conventional infantry forces a quantum leap in firepower and tactical capabilities. It can be mounted on vehicles, helicopters, and even small boats, which offers greater operational flexibility and enables force projection and protection on a large and impressive scale. There is no equivalent weapon of war. The machine gun was introduced during the late 18th century and presented a new menace to the battlefield. Since that time, military tactics, techniques, and operational procedures have been constantly revised and updated to take into account the new dynamic brought to combat situations by the machine gun. Failure to adapt traditional formations and responses to this new threat would have meant certain annihilation. The machine gun revolutionized infantry forces. It gave one man the firepower of an entire company and the capability to engage multiple targets continuously as long as there was ammunition available. However, the introduction of the machine gun was initially resisted, despite the strategic advantages it offered. Many armies, especially those with cavalry, saw the machine gun as a threat to their domain and even dismissed its capabilities. General George Armstrong Custer of the 7th U.S. Cavalry reportedly declined the use of machine guns just prior to the Battle of Little Bighorn because he thought they would burden his troops. In the 18th century, artillery was the god of war, and far more value was attached to a field gun than a machine gun. Therefore, the concept of a machine gun had many hurdles to overcome before it was accepted onto the battlefield. The first machine guns were crude and cumbersome by today's standards, but for their day, they represented the cutting edge in technology. Aspects of their original method of operation have passed the test of time and are still in use, although in a more modern form. This is the case with the multi-barreled Gatling gun, which is based on Richard Jordan Gatling's original design. Modern versions of the Gatling gun are capable of firing a staggering 6,000 rounds per minute, which is considerably more than its creator could have imagined. The Gatling gun is probably the most famous and well-known rapid-firing gun. It was first patented in 1861 by Gatling and was the first weapon to offer controlled sequential automatic fire with automatic loading. But by strict definition, it was not a machine gun. It featured machine loading of prepared cartridges and a hand-operated crank for sequential high-speed firing. The Gatling was not used very much in the Civil War, despite its effectiveness in combat, but it was widely exported after this period. The Gatling had a competitor, the Maxim gun. This rival was also an extremely efficient weapon system, but its rate of fire was lower than the Gatling's because of its air-cooled, recoil-operated design. The Maxim gun is considered to be the first true machine gun. It was invented in 1881 and was capable of firing 500 rounds per minute. It took its name from its designer, Hiram Maxim. The use of the machine gun rose dramatically during World War I, and unsurprisingly, the number of casualties also increased. The war defined the role of the machine gun and identified it as the ultimate killing system. The combination of machine gun and the might of massed artillery bombardments during World War I had a lethal effect. During the Battle of the Somme, in just one day, German machine gunners equipped with Maxims and Spandaus mowed down nearly 20,000 British soldiers as they advanced. The Germans were quick to realize the potential of machine guns and developed their field tactics around this new force multiplier. The British, however, came to this realization much later and did not initially utilize machine guns to their full potential. All sides were equipped with medium and heavy caliber machine guns, and newer, smaller automatic weapons were beginning to appear. These became known as submachine guns. World War I was also the debut of the bomber and fighter aircraft. Fighter aircraft generally carried only one or two machine guns, with bombers carrying slightly more. Machine gun calibers rarely exceeded 763 millimeters, as the firing of larger calibers would have shaken the airframe to pieces. In the early days of aircraft machine gun operation, pilots had to fire their guns through their own propellers. This was a very risky technique. If the pilot didn't get the timing right, he would shoot down his own aircraft. To protect an aircraft from its own ammunition, metal plates were fitted on the propellers to deflect the rounds while firing. This was a crude approach, but it worked. Eventually, more sophisticated systems were developed that featured synchronization devices that timed machine gun bursts between propeller rotations. Around the same time, the U.S. and its allies were producing a number of fighter aces. One of the most famous was Captain Eddie Rickenbacker of the Hat in the Ring Squadron. Fighter aircraft of World War I were made out of canvas and wood. It often took only one shot to bring them down in a dogfight. By the outbreak of World War II, aircraft were mounting more and more machine guns. Some had as many as 8 303s, such as the British Hurricane. Some aircraft, such as the P-51 Mustang, only carried around 4 or 6 weapons. Continuing developments in aviation produced aircraft that were much faster and therefore much harder to hit. Larger caliber machine guns, such as the .50 caliber, became the weapon of choice for fighters and bombers. They combined range and stopping power. Allied aircraft also flew in new tight formations during bombing missions over Germany. This made it much harder for enemy fighters to attack individual aircraft without fear of being hit themselves. The B-17 was so heavily armed that it was called the Flying Fortress. It and other airborne giants had as many as 13 machine guns on board. Another U.S. bomber that featured heavy defensive weaponry was the B-24 Liberator, which was used by both the U.S. and British with great success. The Liberator featured 8 .50 caliber heavy machine guns mounted in various key positions around the aircraft. The lethal .50 caliber was also mounted in the U.S. Lightning fighter aircraft, which packed all of its weaponry into its nose. Following the end of World War II, the Korean War provided the stage for the next great test of machine gun-based air power. Highly capable and maneuverable F-86 Sabre fighters were pitted against state-of-the-art Soviet MiG-15 fighters in the service of Korea. The F-86 retained the 6 machine gun armament of World War II fighters. On the face of it, the U.S. Air Force fighter was at a disadvantage over the Soviet-built MiG-15, which had a powerful 37-millimeter cannon and 2 smaller cannon. But the Russian guns had a slow rate of fire and were not very accurate. An unknown fact at the time was that many of these Korean aircraft were actually being flown by Russian World War II veterans. Their skills were matched by those of the U.S.'s own experienced pilots, which only intensified the war in the skies. The United Nations prevailed by scoring a kill ratio of around 8 to every single loss. Better U.S. tactics making up for any deficiencies in gunpowder. The Korean War marked the end of machine gun-armed fighters. The cannon took over, providing the greater range required for modern air combat. Machine guns were a valued addition to helicopter armaments and were the aircraft's key weapon during the Vietnam War. Helicopter-mounted machine guns were mainly used for self-defense during troop insertions and extractions. But in the case of dedicated machine gun-armed gunships, their role was clearly offensive. In Vietnam, helicopters flew over potential ambush points, which gunners sprayed with bursts of machine gun fire as a means of drawing a reaction from the enemy and establishing the situation below. If fire was received back, then another less hazardous landing zone was selected. However, there were some situations that required more stealth than firepower. A combat search and rescue mission to extract a downed pilot would be just such a scenario. But the rescue copters always had their machine guns loaded and ready for self-defense or for pinning down enemy forces while performing an extraction. Armies also need a way to suppress incoming fire from the ground. Virtually every military vehicle, from transporters to tanks, carries machine guns for self-defense. These are usually medium or large caliber weapons, as they need to be effective against other vehicles or dug-in troops. However, using large caliber weapons has its disadvantages. There is an increased risk of causing collateral damage among friendly forces or local inhabitants. During the Vietnam War, the .50 calibers of U.S. river patrol vessels cruising the Mekong Delta were so powerful that they often hit local villages located hundreds of yards beyond intended targets. Machine gun tactics and techniques also vary from army to army, with some being more proficient than others. This was illustrated during World War II by the Germans, who were the undisputed masters of machine gun tactics and techniques. They used their soldiers to support the machine gun rather than the other way around. This innovative approach met the high demands of 1940s blitzkrieg-style warfare. The Allies also had their strengths, particularly in the use of light machine guns. They used a .303 caliber weapon called the Bren gun, which was years ahead of its time in terms of design and usability. The Bren was a highly accurate weapon, and it and its crew were considered very valuable. It even had its own dedicated tracked support vehicle called the Bren Carrier. These carriers were quick and maneuverable and often rode point for convoys. And if the need arose, they had no difficulty in fighting their way out of trouble. World War I had taught both sides many lessons. Among these was the sheer cost and waste in terms of human life of fighting from static positions such as the trenches. Soldiers in World War II were virtually always on the move, and therefore machine guns had to be much lighter and more reliable for a more mobile infantry. This period of machine gun history saw the development of classic designs on both sides. The Germans fielded their superb MG-34 and MG-42, the first true general-purpose machine guns able to be used in both light and heavy machine gun roles. In U.S. service, the Browning .50 caliber was a firm favorite with all forces due to its superb reputation for reliability and packing serious stopping power. The Browning is still in widespread production and use worldwide. Lessons learned in World War II led to the design and development of machine guns focusing mainly around weapons of medium caliber. The bar was set by the outstanding German Maschinengewehr MG42, a weapon capable of firing at a rate of 1,200 to 1,800 rounds per minute, more than twice the rate of any Allied weapon. Many of the most successful modern designs, such as the M60, which is known as the Pig, and the British GPMG, were inspired by the MG42. These popular weapons are quite heavy to carry around and require smaller caliber light machine guns to complement them in the role of light support. One of the best known weapons of the light support class is the 5.56mm M249 Mini-Me. In U.S. service, the Mini-Me is called a Squad Assault Weapon, or SAW. The SAW is of Belgian origin and is without doubt one of the best light machine guns in service. It is usually fitted with a box magazine containing an ammunition belt of between 200 and 250 rounds. But in an emergency, it can use conventional M16 magazines. Under U.S. law, a machine gun is defined in part by the National Firearms Act of 1934, 26 U.S.C., as any weapon which shoots automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. This definition seems straightforward, but confusion arises when machine guns are compared with submachine guns, cannons, and grenade launchers. Therefore, machine guns are also put into three categories. The first is the light machine gun, such as the SAW. These are usually of .556 caliber and require one soldier to operate and fire them. The second category is medium, such as the M60, also known as general-purpose machine guns. These are usually of 7.62 caliber and usually require two operating personnel in the roles of feeder and firer. The third category is heavy, such as the M2. These are generally of 12.7mm caliber and require 1 to 2 personnel to operate. Any weapon with a caliber larger than a 15mm is categorized as a cannon or grenade launcher, not a machine gun. For infantrymen operating without vehicle support, the ideal choice of machine guns are those from the light and medium categories. These weapons may be carried around and operated by individual soldiers, unlike the heavy machine guns. It is not uncommon to see both light and medium machine guns operating side by side in an infantry formation. The deployment of these two weapons in common use also reveals sound tactical thinking. One complements the other. The light machine gun offers a faster cyclic rate of fire and is good for short-range suppression, and the medium machine gun has greater range and stopping power. The heavy machine gun is often vehicle or tripod mounted. It is used as a heavy support weapon, generally deployed to complement automatic grenade launchers and light mortars. Most machine guns are usually mounted in one of four ways. They can be mounted on a bipod, which is often integrated within the weapons and is adjustable by means of extendable legs. Bipods are commonly used on light machine guns and some medium types, such as the M60 and British GPMG. They can be mounted on a tripod when sustained fire is needed, or for the defense of static positions. Once set up, the weapon can fire continuously on a fixed target without any deviation. Tripods are for use on medium and heavy caliber weapons. They can also be mounted on pintle mounts for use on vehicles, ships, aircraft, or helicopters. These are basically steel posts set into a sturdy frame. Guns on tripods and pintle mounts are usually used with spade grips rather than pistol grips. And lastly, machine guns can be fitted to detached or remotely operated mountings, such as those found in a coaxial system like in a tank or helicopter. These are generally part of a sophisticated targeting system that usually includes night vision devices and thermal imagers. Following combat experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, future military operations are likely to see the increased use of remotely operated machine guns. These offer far greater protection to the soldiers operating them. All machine guns require three key components for operation: a feed system, a trigger mechanism, and an extractor system. A feed system loads the chamber. Cartridges can be fed into the changer by a variety of methods, with the most common being magazines and ammunition belts. A trigger mechanism fires the round. This includes the actual trigger, a trigger sear to catch the bolt, a bolt and firing pin, and other integral components. Typically, the act of pulling the trigger causes the firing pin to strike the primer on the round in the chamber and then disengages the sears. This allows continual cycling of the bolt until the trigger is released. A sear then grabs the bolt of firing pins. This stops the machine gun at some point in its cycle. An extractor system ejects the spent or misfired cartridge. Usually, this is a fairly simple device, such as a claw. A pin on the side of the bolt catches a ridge of the cartridge and flicks it out of an ejection port. These three components form a mechanism which must be powered. If powered by absorbing the recoil of a cartridge, it is called recoil-operated. If powered by the expanding gases of a fired cartridge, it is called gas-actuated. If powered by an external force, such as a motor, it is usually called a chain gun. All machine guns follow a cycle when they are operated. The spent cartridge is removed through an ejection port. The trigger mechanism is cocked so that the weapon can be fired again. The next round is loaded into the firing chamber, and spring tension, or a rotating piece of metal known as a cam, forces the new round and bolt back into the firing chamber. A mechanism then makes the firing pin fire the cartridge and activates the ejection and reloading by gas or recoil. And then the cycle repeats. A full cycle takes only a fraction of a second to complete and can occur many times per second. The operation of a machine gun is basically the same, whatever the means of activating its mechanisms. Submachine guns and machine pistols, such as the Uzi and MAC-10, are usually blowback operated. Most squad automatic weapons and assault rifles are gas actuated. The M16 operates by integrating the piston with the bolt, while in weapons based on the Soviet Kalashnikov design, the piston is attached directly to a bolt carrier that unlocks and operates the bolt. A recoil action machine gun uses the recoil to unlock and then operate the action. Recoil action weapons, including the Browning M2 50 caliber, which all feature a large cocking lever for feeding the first round into the breech. An externally actuated machine gun uses an external power source. This used to be a simple hand crank, but now an electric motor is used to move its mechanism through the firing sequence. Most weapons of this type are called chain guns, in reference to their driving mechanisms. Gatling guns and revolver cannons have several barrels or chambers on a rotating carousel and a system of cams that load, cock, and fire each mechanism progressively as it rotates through the sequence. The continuous nature of the rotary action allows for an incredibly high cyclic rate of fire, often several thousand rounds per minute. Not all chain guns use multiple barrels or chambers. Chain guns are less prone to jamming than a gun operated by gas or recoil, because the external power source will eject misfired rounds without further trouble. This is not possible if the power comes from the round itself. Externally powered guns are generally used with large shells of 20 millimeters in diameter or more. Some, such as the M134 minigun, fire much smaller cartridges. The types that use larger shells offer benefits of reliability and firepower, but the weight and size of the power source and driving mechanism makes them impractical for use outside of a vehicle or aircraft mount. Heavy and medium machine guns were often water-cooled, but most now have interchangeable barrels, which must be changed periodically to avoid overheating. The higher the rate of fire, the more often barrels must be changed and allowed to cool. To minimize this, most air-cooled guns are fired only in short bursts or at a reduced rate of fire.
Set your sights, too slow! Round straight! Round straight! Set your sights, you'll waste the ammunition! Round straight! Round straight! Round straight! Round straight! Too slow! Single target! Single target! Come on! 3 targets! 3 targets! Round hole! Round hole! Round hole! Oh!
Machine gun operation can be triggered in many ways. These include hand cranks, pistol-type triggers, paddles, spade grips, joysticks, and of course, electronic buttons. Ammunition can be fed into machine guns by many different